Let's talk about wide receivers that you should start or sit in week 3 of the fantasy football season. I'm going to go through all 32 teams, 16 matchups in total. You can pause your screen now. If you want to go to a specific matchup, you got the time code. And by the way, I'm guaranteeing a reply to the first 3 comments on every video this year, so make sure you're subscribed and you turn your notifications on. And also, right here, you've got the terminology that I'm going to use explained throughout the entire video. Let's start with Thursday Night Football. We've got the Dolphins at the Bills. I'm personally very excited for this matchup. It looks like an incredible matchup here on Thursday night. Shout out to Amazon. It's the second highest over-under of the week at 49.5 points. However, the Bills are favored by 12.5 points. That is the largest spread of the week. In fact, that is the largest spread of the entire season. That's how much Vegas thinks the Bills are going to dominate this matchup. Now, here's the unfortunate part of this all. Just because the Bills are going to dominate does not mean that you have to start your Buffalo Bill wide receivers, because just last week, the Bills absolutely dominated the New York Jets. And who were you happy to start at wide receiver? Absolutely nobody. Elijah Moore had 1 target. He led the way with 10.7 points because he got into the end zone. Joshua Palmer was your wide receiver too. Keon Coleman only 5.6 points, only 4 targets. Khalil Shakir had just 1 single target. So unfortunately, this is not an offense where if they're projected to be dominant, that automatically means the wide receivers are must starts. Both Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir, those would be the names I would chase if you're going to put one of these guys into your lineup, and I would prefer Keon of any other name just because of what we've seen for the totality of the season. But that does not mean they're going to be incredible fantasy assets. So what you have to hope for if you're starting a build this week is that the Dolphins can at least keep this a competitive match. But be very cautious. You can actually see all of my rankings for the wide receivers for every matchup in the graphics. So hopefully that will help you answer your question if you're not sure which players to start. Let's look at the Dolphins side of the ball. Things were not great in week number 1. And, week 2 wasn't awesome, but for the wide receivers in particular here in Miami, we did see a lot of signs of life. So we saw Tyreek Hill, 48 snaps, 35 routes run, 7 targets. We saw Jalen Waddle, 6 targets. And then we saw Malik Washington, who had a very important role in week 1. His role actually decreased slightly in week number 2. That's great for these Miami Dolphins receivers. Jalen Waddle, 17 points, 5 catches, 68 yards, and a touchdown. Tyreek Hill eclipsed 100 yards for the first time in what feels like years. That's great for fantasy football. That's a really good sign. However, that doesn't mean it's going to translate from one week to the next. Of any receiver in this matchup, I trust Tyreek Hill the most, but to be honest, I don't have a lot of trust built with any of these names in this entire matchup, point blank period, but I do think you can start Tyreek Hill. The good news is, if they're going to be down, they're probably going to have to throw the ball. And Tyreek Hill is still their number 1 wide receiver in Miami. Jalen Waddle is a flexible name, so he's definitely not a top 24 play for me. But if you don't have a better flex, you can throw him in there, high over under, hope that they're throwing, with the game, out of balance for the Dolphins. Okay, let's move on to the start of the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games. We've got the Falcons at the Panthers. Now, in week number 1, the Falcons heavily targeted Drake London, and it looked like we were going to see Drake London get 10 targets each and every single week. Now, it's important to remember that Drake London is dealing with an injury that might have limited him here in week number 2, where he had just 4 targets versus the Minnesota Vikings. However, also keep in mind that there wasn't really a point during that game versus Minnesota that the Falcons needed to throw the ball. In fact, in the 4th quarter, we were seeing Tyler Algier get a bunch of work because J.J. McCarthy and the Vikings just could not keep up. So could that be a similar game script this week versus the Panthers? The Falcons are our favorites, even though it's at Carolina, the 3.5-point favorites. However, still, if Drake London is playing, I cannot tell anyone in good faith to sit him. He has got to be in your lineups, point blank period. And I do anticipate him getting much more than 4 targets here in week number 3. Let's hope he gets more healthy. He's probably not going to practice or be limited in practice throughout the week, but let's definitely put him into our lineups. As far as Darnell Mooney, there's just not enough inbuilt trust with Michael Penix for me to tell you to start him with any confidence. At best, he's a Hail Mary play. 95% of you have a better name. And then on the opposite side of the ball, we are going to go ahead and start Tetaroa McMillan. He has looked absolutely incredible. I don't think it's crazy to say he has been the best player on the Panthers, period, in the first 2 weeks. Any player, any position, he's been incredible. He was targeted 10 times this last week, and for the first time in his career, he went over 100 yards. He got 6 of those targets for 100 yards. he and Bryce Young are going to continue to get on the same page. You got to start T-Mac if you have him in pretty much every single format, just because of the volume, because of how talented he is. Then Hunter Renfrow is a name we should talk about. This is a name that you may be picking up off the waiver wire this week. He's a sneaky flex option. For example, between Darnell Mooney and Hunter Renfrow, I would rather start Hunter Renfrow this week. Yes, you are throwing a Hail Mary, but at least this week we saw 9 targets for Hunter Renfrow. He caught 7 of them for 2 receiving touchdowns. Could this be the Adam Thielen replacement? We've seen plenty of examples where Bryce Young wants to hyper target his slot wide receiver. Could Hunter Renfrow be the next great slot receiver in fantasy for Bryce Young? We'll find out here soon. All right, let's move on to the Packers at the Browns. So here's the deal for this matchup. 42.5 points. That is the second lowest over under of the week. So Vegas does not expect a lot of fantasy points in this game. The Packers are also favored by 8.5 points. So it's the second largest spread of the week in favor of the Green Bay Packers. And I'll be honest, even though the Packers are favorites, this is setting up, and I could be wrong, but this is setting up for another huge bust for the Packer wide receivers. Last week, I said this before Thursday Night Football on this very video. I told you guys, there's going to be a Packer wide receiver that has a good day. I have no idea who to tell you who that's going to be. It ended up being Romeo Doubs. Doubs had a fine day, but because the Packers defense was so elite and they were able to run the ball out in the second half, they did not need to throw the ball much at all. Now, unfortunately, when you have so many names, I know Jayden Reed is out, right? Jayden Reed's not going to be a problem, but even without Jayden Reed, you have so many names that are trying to get the piece of a very small pie. It is difficult each and every week to rely on those names. So, unfortunately for Romeo Doubs, unfortunately for Matthew Golden, I would not be trusting them in my lineup because who knows, Dontavion Wicks could have the best day of any of these receivers, or none of them could be good because they don't need to throw the ball versus the Browns, right? There's a reason this is the second largest spread of the week. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, we could see some beautiful garbage time for Cedric Tillman and for Jerry Jeudy. Now, unfortunately, if you drafted Jerry Jeudy, right now Cedric Tillman is outproducing him. He looks like the better player. Here's the good news for both of them. They're both running a ton of routes. They're both playing a high percentage of the snaps, and they're both getting heavily targeted, okay? So that is at least great news if they're one of your last flex options. This week, Cedric Tillman does get the touchdown. It was a little bit of a fluke, but he still got into the end zone. 10.2 fantasy points. Jerry Jeudy did not get into the end zone, but he had double the yardage that a Cedric Tillman had. So both of these names are spot starts at best. Low-end wide receiver 3, 4s, flex options at this point. If you're in a start 7, you're probably not playing them. If you're in a start 8 or a start 9 lineup, you can probably put them into your flex spot. All right, let's move on to the Texans at the Jags. Now, here's the good news for Nico Collins. He was heavily targeted in week number 2, targeted in the end zone. However, he and CJ Stroud just couldn't exactly get on the same page. Of course, the first pass that he caught was a touchdown, a long touchdown. He had a fine fantasy day. I would expect him to be even better in week number 3 versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. They have given up the 6th most points to fantasy wide receivers through the first 2 weeks. So absolutely, Nico Collins is in our lineups. And if you are in a position where you can trade for him, definitely go do so. I don't care if Christian Kirk is back. We can't trust another receiver here. Between Higgins, Hutchinson, Knoll, Kirk, they're even playing Watson. They have not really committed to another receiver outside of Collins, and it's just disgusting, okay? Now, on the opposite side of the ball, look at me in the eye. If you own Brian Thomas, I feel you. It's been tough, all right? I totally get where you're coming from, but I cannot in good consciousness tell you to sit Brian Thomas. This is a guy who's averaging almost 10 targets per game through the first 2 weeks. Now, Brian Thomas is an uber talent, okay? And he did not live up to his talent here in week number 2. We can all agree on that, okay? However, he did get 11 targets. He ran the most routes. He had the most snaps of any wide receiver. We did see Travis Hunter's role kind of scaled back because they used him a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball. So I know, again, it didn't turn into a good fantasy day, only 9 fantasy points, but he did not play up to his potential. He played scared. He was lackadaisical. I do expect his coaching staff to be in his ear this entire week. I expect him to be a much better version of himself and what should be a very competitive game here in week 3. I am starting Brian Thomas, and I'm going to go ahead and call a bounce back week for him in week number 3. Now, as far as Travis Hunter goes, we actually hinted at it a little bit earlier, but unfortunately in week number 2, we did see him scale back as far as his usage as a receiver. In week number 1, he was much more a receiver, didn't get used much on defense, but in week number 2, he was used more on defense. So each and every week, it's going to be a little bit hard to predict with a Travis Hunter. Here's what I will say. Because the boundary corners for the Texans are so good, I would not be shocked if they are more focused on using Travis Hunter in this game as a slot. So that is potentially good news for him. He is a spot start at best, a flex option at best. Okay, let's move on to the Bengals at the Vikings. Now, we have got to talk about the elephant in the room. That is Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow is said elephant. Joe Burrow will not play for the next 3 months. He might not play again this year. We don't really know. Now, Jake Browning is going to be the starting quarterback for the Bengals here this week. And I know everybody's going to say, Zach, how can you come out here and have Jamar Chase as your wide receiver 7? He's not in your top 5? Look at what he did last week with Jake Browning. Okay, I understand. That was one single game with Jake Browning. I understand the scheme is a little bit different. Jamar Chase is running different routes this year than he was running in previous seasons. However, in 56 games with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase is the league winner. 20.7 PPR points per game. However, in the 7 games since Jamar Chase was in the league without Joe Burrow, he's averaging just 11.1 PPR points. That is a very large sample size. Hear what I'm saying. I'm still starting Jamar Chase. I can't think of a league out there where you're sending Jamar Chase, but we are lowering our expectations. We have to lower our expectations. Same thing can be said for T. Higgins, who is now a spot start for me, no longer in the must start category. My wide receiver 28 this week. In 59 games with Joe Burrow, averaging 15.2 points per game. In 11 games without him, just 11.8 points per game. Now, the gap isn't as wide for Higgins missing Joe Burrow as it is for Jamar Chase, but still, we have to lower our expectations for these two names. Now, the good news is they are facing the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings haven't been able to get much going offensively, so that has led their defense being on the field a lot more often. However, the Vikings are giving up the 3rd fewest points per game to wide receivers in fantasy right now, so this could be a trap game for these Cincinnati Bengals. There's so many red flags, but for the vast majority of you guys, I can't imagine you have a better option to put into your lineup. I'm sorry, there's not better news. You probably have to start them, but be aware there is serious bust potential here. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, Justin Jefferson is our wide receiver 6. JJ McCarthy is not going to play with an ankle sprain. What do you guys think? Does he really have an ankle sprain? I don't know. There's no reason for me to really dive into that. But we are going to start Justin Jefferson. You can make a case. Carson Wentz might be better for Justin Jefferson. The Cincinnati Bengals defense is awful. You can put him into your lineup. He should have his best week yet. All right, let's go to the Steelers at the Patriots. This one is very simple for the Steelers, in my opinion. You go ahead and you start DK Metcalf with a ton of confidence this week. The Patriots have given up the 2nd most points to fantasy wide receivers through 2 weeks of the NFL so far. However, there has been no Christian Gonzalez. So to be fair, context is very, very important, but this is a great matchup. We should see DK Metcalf have a big game. On the opposite side of the ball, the Steelers are middle of the pack against wide receivers so far. Stephon Diggs has been the most targeted wide receiver with the New England Patriots. However, obviously, Kayshon Boutte has been the most impressive wide receiver. What was weird about last week was Boutte came out there, he had 1 catch, 1 target, and it was a touchdown. It was a beautiful catch in the first quarter, but they didn't really use him ever again that entire game. I thought we were going to see another breakout game for Kayshon Boutte, but Stephon Diggs, the highest targeted wide receiver, only 5 targets. Regardless, there is no real sign in this wide receiver room to tell you that any of these guys are a must start. All these guys have a very low floor and not a high ceiling, so proceed with caution. All right, let's move on to the Rams at the Eagles. 45.5 point over under. The Eagles are favored by 4.5 points. I know it's not the highest over under of the week, according to Vegas, but this is where I anticipate the most fantasy points coming from in week number 3. I know these are 2 good defenses, but they're 2 elite offenses as well. I'm expecting Puka Nacua, my wide receiver 1, to continue the ball rolling with an incredible fantasy performance. Devontae Adams, my guy this year, we're expecting him again to have another great performance here in week number 2. And then on the opposite side of the ball, I'm going to go ahead and call my shot. I think A.J. Brown has a huge bounce back. I think the Eagles, this will be the first game this entire year that they're going to need to throw the ball in the second half of a game, right? So I expect A.J. Brown to have a great game. You know, I'm a little bit hesitant on Devonta Smith. The good news for A.J. Brown, 8 targets. For Devonta Smith, only 6 last week. So Devonta Smith is still very much boom bust, but you can put him in there as a flex option. All right, let's jump to the Jets at the Bucks. 44.5 point over under. The Bucs are favored by almost a full touchdown, and that's probably because Justin Fields is in concussion protocol. Right now, my expectation would be that he doesn't play in this game. However, I can't say that for certain. Let's go ahead and monitor the practice reports throughout the week. If Justin Fields is not playing, Garrett Wilson becomes a spot start for me. No longer a top 24 play, my wide receiver 27. This is an offense that does not throw the ball very much. Tyrod Taylor is not that big of a downgrade from Justin Fields, but it's just not a great situation for him to be in. Now, if Justin Fields plays, we'll go ahead and put Garrett Wilson as a top 21 play, our wide receiver 21, should Garrett Wilson get in there this week. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, Emeka Egbuka, Mike Evans, they're both going to continue to be must-starts for me in fantasy football. Egbuka back-to-back weeks with the touchdown. He looks like he's filling the Chris Godwin role with ease. We love to see that. And Mike Evans was so close to a big game last week. Don't give up on him. There are plenty of injuries to keep up with this week. The reality is the NFL news is constantly changing. The best tool for your fantasy football season is going to be the 2025 season pass on the Flock site with the promo code LAND. Use my code. It's a $34 one-time purchase. I'll be answering your start-sit questions, your trade questions on our live stream. You get access to my latest rankings, both weekly rankings as well as rest of season rankings. Check that out in the pinned comment if you want to be ready to go for the entire season. All right, let's look at the Colts at the Titans here. Michael Pittman had a tough matchup last week versus Patrick Surtain. He was not great for fantasy football. He was actually one of our sits of the week. However, this week, he's facing the Titans. The Titans have given up the fourth most points to fantasy wide receivers through the first 2 weeks. So I do think you can start Michael Pittman with some confidence. The good news for Josh Downs is he did get back out there and had 8 targets last week. However, in what should be a game that the Colts are favored in, the Titans offense has looked really muddy. I would be really hesitant to start Josh Downs just because I'm not sure the Colts are going to have to be in a situation where they really need to throw the ball. So I would be hesitant throwing him into my lineup. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, unfortunately, Calvin Ridley has not been a good start in any of the first 2 weeks. He and Calvin Ridley are not on the same page just yet. The offense is very lethargic, and Alec Manor is currently outproducing him. I think that both of these guys, both Alec Manor and Calvin Ridley, are guys that I would prefer to be on my bench if I can. But if you can't keep them on your bench, you can go ahead and put them in there. They're very risky starts just because we can't trust this offense just yet. But I do love Alec Manor as a stash. He got into the end zone last week. It was off of a blown play, kind of a broken play. So have lower expectations. Let's move to the Raiders at the Commanders. Now, we need to have some conversations here. It's a 47.5 point over-under. That's great. The Commanders are favored by 5.5 points. That's great. However, the bad news for these wide receivers is we don't know if Jaden Daniels is going to play yet. Now, he did have a knee sprain on Thursday Night Football. According to Grant Paulson, who's a beat writer in Washington, he does not expect him to play this week. So my rankings that you're seeing right now are if Jaden Daniels is playing. If Jaden Daniels is playing, both Terry and Debo are going straight into my lineups. We have seen multiple weeks the Raiders secondary get completely exposed by different quarterbacks and wide receivers. They're giving up the 8th most points of fantasy wide receivers through 2 weeks. Now, if Jaden Daniels is out, we need to be a little bit more cautious. We cannot trust Marcus Mariota the same way we trust Jaden Daniels, all right? I would anticipate if it is Marcus Mariota, they're going to be much more run-focused in Washington, so proceed with caution. Again, you can see my rankings here. Should that be the case. And then, of course, in Las Vegas, the only name you can trust is Jacoby Myers. All right, let's move on to the start of the afternoon slate of games. We've got the Broncos at the Chargers. I know, guys, it wasn't a great game for Courtland Sutton last week. You might have been disappointed. I hear you, but I cannot tell you to sit him. We are still going to start him. We have plenty of good, history of him having great weeks with Bo Nix. This week, he was outsnapped by Troy Franklin. He had, less targets than Troy Franklin. But I would not expect that to be a trend that continues each and every week. Franklin is a great stash. He's a risky play in here week number 2, but I am going to go ahead and tell you to start Courtland Sutton with a lot of confidence. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, this entire offense is really based around the passing game in Los Angeles, which is not what any of us anticipated heading into 2025. Think about it. Greg Roman, John Harbaugh, all of the teams that these guys have led have been run-heavy teams. And in 2025, so far through 2 games, they are just letting Justin Herbert rip it down the field, man, which has made Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnson, Keenan Allen all great starts through the first 2 weeks. So I can't tell you to sit any of these names If anything, I might be a little bit more hesitant on a Johnson, and because he's probably playing outside, that's where Pat Surtain might be. It's not a great matchup for these guys, but I do think they're fine flex options. They have such a safe floor, and Johnson is getting targeted so heavily. I don't know how I'm going to tell you not to play one of these names. All right, let's move on to the Saints at the Seahawks. This is the lowest over-under of the week at 41.5 points. It's also the third largest spread of the week in favor of the Seahawks. For the Saints, the only name I'm going to tell you to start with any sort of confidence is Chris Olave. In fact, he would have had a touchdown if he didn't drop a wide open, pass. Let's be honest. All right, Rattler hit him right in his numbers. He dropped it. He wasn't anticipating it, but he could have had an even bigger game. He has had 10 or more targets in each of the first 2 weeks. That's a great sign. He walks away with just 11.4 fantasy points this week, but he could have had an even bigger day. He's the only one I trust. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, JSN, again, the only one I trust on this offense for the Seattle Seahawks. JSN has been so good. It's been so fun to watch him as a JSN truther. This week, he had 9 targets, back-to-back weeks over 9 targets, back-to-back weeks over 100 receiving yards for Jackson Smith-Njigba. Safe floor, such a high ceiling. Pop him into your lineup and be happy with it. All right, let's move on to the Cowboys at the Bears. This is the third highest over-under of the week. We should see a lot of fantasy points in this matchup here. The Bears are favored by 1.5 points. Of course, you're starting CeeDee Lamb. We all know that. He's either your wide receiver 1 or 2 in rankings this week. But George Pickens is becoming a more reliable option. This is exactly what we wanted to see for George Pickens. In week 1, we didn't see it. In week 2, we did. 8 targets. He comes out there and gets the end zone targets as well. Gets a touchdown, 68 yards, 5 catches, almost 18 fantasy points. Beautiful. Now he faces the Bears, who just lost all-pro cornerback Jalen Johnson. That is a huge piece they're going to miss for the rest of the season. The Bears go from a matchup that you regretted last year to a matchup you're targeting this year. No Jalen Johnson. That defense is giving up the 5th most points to wide receivers through the first 2 weeks. Start your CeeDee Lambs, start your George Pickens. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, it is looking like through the first 2 weeks that Rome Odunze is indeed the wide receiver 1 in Chicago. All right, he has led the team in targets in back-to-back weeks. He had 10 targets in week number 2 compared to just 6 for Rome Odunze, and he scored 2 touchdowns against the Lions, 128 yards, a true breakout, over 31 fantasy points this week. He's a top 15 play for me. The great news for Odunze is even if the Bears are down, this is a great defense to go out and attack, and he has that chemistry with Caleb Williams. Now, as far as DJ Moore goes, you can put him in there as your wide receiver 2 or a flex, but you need to lower your expectations because he is not getting these natural, chemistry mind meld targets when Caleb Williams is breaking the pocket. Caleb Williams is typically looking for Rome Odunze. All right, let's move on to the Cardinals at the 49ers. Unfortunately, after a great week 1 for Marvin Harrison, it was a down week number 2. To be fair, they didn't really need to throw the ball against the Carolina Panthers, so that played a part in Marvin Harrison only having 4 targets, but they ran under 30 routes. Again, they just did not need to throw the ball. Now it will be a more competitive matchup versus the 49ers. It's a 1.5 point spread in favor of the Cardinals here, but it should be a very close game. I think we should see a bounce back for Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, if Juwan Jennings is playing, he is my preferred target at this point between him and Ricky Pearsall. I think they will have weeks where one shines and then the other shines. But if Juwan Jennings is not playing, then Ricky Pearsall will get a nice bump. He'll get a bump 10 spots up in my rankings because he would be really the only target for Mac Jones. But it looks like Mac Jones is comfortable targeting Juwan Jennings. So if Jennings is healthy, he is our preferred option. Both of these guys are flex options at best. All right. I hope you're just as hyped as I am for week number 3. I just set my latest DFS lineup, by the way. This is on FastDraft's Quick 6 Super Slam contest. I am playing CeeDee Lamb, and I'm giving him 2 times the bonus points. Puka Nacua, Javonte versus the Bears, Rome Odunze on the opposite side of that ball, DK Metcalf, and Jordan Mason. Now, week 3, the contest just opened. All you have to do is choose 6 non-quarterbacks. Whichever lineup has the most points wins the most amount of money. Download the FastDraft app, use my code LAND, I'll match your deposit up to $50, and then you're going to get my week 3 rankings completely free. All right, that takes us to Sunday Night Football, the Chiefs at the Giants. The Chiefs are favored by 5.5 points. It's a 43.5 point over under, so nothing crazy. Now let's talk about the Chiefs, okay? Here's the good news. The good news is no other team in the NFL has given up more fantasy points to wide receivers than the New York Giants, okay? That's the good news. The bad news is we have no idea who you can trust in this offense. Hollywood Brown comes out and gets 14 targets in week 1. We said, hey, pump the brakes. You can pick him up, but lower expectations. He comes out in week number 2 and, has a little bit more of a mediocre day. Tyquan Thornton catches a long ball. At the time of recording this, we don't know if Xavier Worthy is going to play or not. So if Xavier Worthy is not playing, those are the rankings you're seeing on your screen. Hollywood Brown is a flexible name because of the matchup. Now, if Xavier Worthy is playing, things get a little bit more difficult, and I would really not have Worthy or Hollywood Brown in the top 39 of my wide receiver rankings. I just don't know who to trust at that point. So hopefully for your sake, there's no Xavier Worthy. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, as crazy as it's going to sound, the Chiefs have also been a great matchup for your fantasy wide receiver. They're giving up the 7th most points to wide receivers through the first 2 weeks. And I do think, obviously, Malik Neighbors, the clear number 1 target in this offense, 13 targets in that crazy game versus the Giants last week. He ended up with, 37.7 fantasy points, 167 yards, 2 touchdowns, caught a couple moon balls from Russell Wilson. He's going straight into your lineup, my wide receiver 3. And it's a great game because they're going to be down. They're going to need him. Now, for Wan'Dale Robinson, he is one of the safer plays that you can put into your lineup, into your last flex spot, but he doesn't have a high ceiling. And I know I say that where he's coming off a game with 10 targets. He comes out there and puts up 28.2 fantasy points. But he is not someone that's going to consistently be used down the field, so lower your expectations. What you should expect is 8 to 12 fantasy points. That's what Wan'Dale Robinson can give you. He's not a ceiling play, but he is a floor play. All right, last matchup of the week. We've got the Lions at the Ravens, Monday Night Football. This is the highest over-under of the week. So, in theory, we should finish the week off with an absolute bang, an absolute monster. We would all love to see that. The Ravens are favored by 5.5 points. I think that spread should be closer. But Amon-Ra St. Brown comes out in week number 2 and just absolutely dominates. He was just an absolute superstar. It was really fun to watch. He had 11 targets. Jameson Williams still involved, right? 52 snaps, more routes run than Amon-Ra St. Brown, but only targeted 4 times. Now, unfortunately, Jameson Williams is going to be a little bit of a boom bust this year. I thought we would get more layups in the John Morton offense, but we haven't seen that just yet. However, in such a high over-under, I would really struggle to not tell you guys to put him into your lineup. I think that we should see the Lions airing the ball out for the majority of this game because Lamar Jackson should also be putting up big-time points. On the opposite side of the ball, Zay Flowers looks like the number 1 target, unquestioned, in the Ravens offense through 2 weeks. He has 10 targets this week, had another great game. Last week he had a huge game. This week he puts up 14.9 points without a touchdown. The problem last year with Zay Flowers was in games without a touchdown, he busted. It looks like he's going to be their most reliable weapon in the receiving game this year. We love to see that. Good news, Lions are a top 10 matchup for wide receivers. Good news, it's a high over-under, so I can't imagine telling you to sit Zay Flowers. Guys, I appreciate you watching the video. Do me a favor, hit the like button to show some love, subscribe if you like the content, and I'll see you guys in the next video. The running back start sit video is already out, so make sure you go check that out on the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Nothing but love. Draft with me every night this week on the FastDraft app where there are thousands of dollars to be won weekly. Getting started is easy. Download the FastDraft app, use the promo code LAND at signup to get your deposit match up to $50. That's up to 10 free entries on us. And when you finish your first DFS contest, I'll send you my weekly rankings completely free. Check out the link in the pinned comment to start drafting today.